Today we're going to talk about, I suppose it's about communication, but more specifically, one of the challenges is, how do you get the client to accept a radically different recommendation? How do you sort of gradually get them to see things your way? Because, if you do all of the studies, get all of your ducks in a row, and only at the end tell them this is our thinking, it's going to be a shock to the system. If you start telling them you're thinking right at the beginning and you don't have any of the analysis to support you, they're going to say, but where's the analysis? Right? You lose some credibility. So how do you manage that trade-off? You tell them too early, you don't have any support to get there, and you can basically build resistance. You tell them too late, and it's going to be a shock to the system. Now, I don't think it's difficult to do this, actually. And one of the reasons why it's not difficult for me is if you look at my career when I was in the firm, I was a troubleshooter. So if you listen to my previous podcast, you will know I've always spoken about my career at the firm, and I was a troubleshooter. I was a partner, and even before I became partner, when I was a principal, they would parachute me into projects all over the world that were struggling. So I've been to Botswana, I've been to Chile, I've been to Brazil, I've been to Turkey, I've been to Italy, I've been to the United States, all over South Africa and so on, Middle East. And if a project was struggling, if the client relationship was unraveling, where the team just couldn't deliver, now my job was to go in there and fix it. And you develop a certain style of communication when you can do that, because you're dealing with a hostile client automatically, a client that doesn't want you there, a client that thinks these consultants are a bunch of idiots, overbilling, overeating, and basically not working. And you've got to bring the client around to your way of thinking, but not just bring the client around to your way of thinking, because that implies that you're not going to fix the client team. You're going to get those consultants working hard again, right? Adding value to the client. So what I want to talk about here is, so the process I follow to communicate to clients in a way that doesn't alienate them, in a way that doesn't belittle them, in the way that doesn't make them feel as if they had a problem. I'll give you a classic example of this. Let's assume we are in week 3 now of the study, and we have to present our initial recommendations to the client. Now, this is what I've seen most people do. Most people go up to a client and say, our hypothesis is Empire International needs to be divisionalized within Empire Energy. And then they'll say, our reasons for saying this are X, Y, blah, 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 blah. Now, human nature will tell you that if you present that, you're presenting an hypothesis, right? But the way you've chosen to present an hypothesis is you've presented it more as a fact. By saying our hypothesis is Empire International should become a division of Empire Energy, you're stating it as a hard fact. And then you're providing reasons why your hypothesis is correct. In effect, you're calling it an hypothesis, but you're not presenting an hypothesis, because that's not how you present hypotheses. Now, the way I would do this, and the way I have done it, is when I'm presenting my thinking early, is I would tell the client, okay, so our hypothesis is if it is difficult to get these skills in the external market, if Empire Energy is going to be Empire International's primary client, and if Empire Energy's primary role for the next 30 years is building power stations, then we believe that Empire International is best served by being divisionalized into Empire Energy, which will lead to lower construction costs, faster turnaround on projects, and fewer blackouts. Now notice the difference there. Notice the emphasis on the if. When you emphasize the if, you are telling the audience that the analysis could go either way. If the analysis goes one way, Empire International will not be divisionalized. If the analysis goes one way, Empire International will be divisionalized. But you're telling them, you're making it clear in the form of communication you've taken that the decision has not been made. Now, if you listen to the consulting offered training, when I teach people to do hypotheses, I always tell them hypotheses has 3 parts. One is due to, so what's causing the observable phenomenon, then what is the observable phenomenon, and then what is the impact of the observable phenomenon. An example of that I say is that due to heavy snow in Canada, trucks delivering clothing at the Gap are delayed, which is leading to out of stocks in stores and lower revenue. Now, people always look at me and say, Michael, why do you do hypotheses that way? But that's the correct way to do hypotheses, because you're conveying to the client that there are certain conditions for the recommendation to be valid, and you're still testing those recommendations. When I verbalize this, I don't say due to, I say if, because I want the client to understand. Well, the client didn't work at McKinsey and BCG for several months or years. They don't understand corporate strategy. They just know what you are telling them. If you state an hypothesis as our hypothesis to divisionalize for these reasons, it comes across as if you're stating a foregone conclusion. But if you say things like, okay, if, and you list out the conditions, then we'll do this, which will lead to this, clients are more accepting. Now, you have to tell clients your initial thinking up front. Because no matter how brilliant your analysis is, if it's a major change and you tell them right at the end, they are going to throw their toys out of the cot. This is not to imply clients are children, just the fact of life. And they deservedly should do that because you haven't brought them along in your thinking. So you have no choice but to expose the clients to your initial thinking, but you have to make sure that they understand this initial thinking. So in the first update, I'll say something like that, right? If we cannot get the skills, if it's not too expensive, if the core business of Empire International is going to be constructing power stations, then it should divisionalize, which will lead to this. Then I'll go back into the next meeting and I'll say, this was our initial hypothesis, if under these conditions. Now, since then, we have done some analysis and we have realized the following. And this is how our hypothesis has changed, right? So our hypothesis is still valid, but we've made some tweaks and adjustments to it. So again, I'm telling the client that the hypothesis is valid, so maybe 30% has been proven or disproven, whatever the case is. We still have to do 60% more. So the client is getting comfortable to understanding the hypothesis. They can see the thinking, but you're not basically throwing them into the deep end, right? It's all about the way you communicate. Now, I'll say this numerous times. It's not about the analysis you have. I mean, of course, you need to have great analysis and so on. But it's about the logic of the discussion, the way you present it, the way you choose to communicate it. And I think that a lot of people who don't work at McKinsey and BCG, and Bain as well, but also people who work at McKinsey and BCG and are very young, they place too much stock in the analysis. The analysis is only going to get you so far. And in corporate strategy, analysis does not get you very far. Because corporate strategy is so nebulous, it's so many moving parts, that even if you did the right analysis in corporate strategy, but if you are inarticulate at articulating it, you're going to have a client who is looking at this correct analysis, but they just can't understand it, or they don't want to understand it because you haven't explained it to them in the right way. And a very simple tactic is you've got to introduce your initial recommendation very early, but word it as a clear hypothesis so the client knows it is still being tested. You haven't made up your mind yet. And then as you go through each update, slowly evolve that hypothesis until over time you've removed the uncertainty. By the time of the final update, well, this was our hypothesis, but now we've tested everything and we believe it is the right recommendation. So when you eventually tell the client this is our recommendation, they know what to expect. But what most people do is they word the hypothesis right up front as a recommendation, which shocks the client, right? And that's the wrong thing to do. So remember, it's not about the analysis. A lot of people are obsessed about analysis. If you have the world's most beautiful analysis, let's assume it's 100% correct, but you're only 10% effective at communicating it. 10% times 100% is only 10%. Only 10% is going to get through to the client. However, if you had 50% effective analysis and you are 100% effective at communicating it, 50% times 100% means 50% gets through. So there's that trade-off you need to understand, right? At a certain point, weak analysis or poorly performed analysis can be well explained and brought together through the communication. But that is something that you need to invest time in. So yes, to those readers who wanted to know, we do explain the initial hypothesis up front. But we word it as a clear working hypothesis, not just in the wording, but in the emphasis of the words, in the manner in which we present it, in the dialogue we initiate, in the way we are willing to interact with the clients to get their feedback in the hypothesis. It's one thing to say this is a hypothesis, but you don't want to talk to the clients, you ignore them, you cut them out of the loop. Then while you may call it an hypothesis, you treat it like a recommendation, the client can see that. So, having worked with very difficult clients, when you're in troubleshooting, you work with difficult clients. I have not yet seen a client that is unreasonable to the point where they just don't want to listen to you. I'm sure they exist, I've just never encountered them, and I've worked with some pretty horrible clients who, once you get to know them and you talk to them and you really understand what they're doing and you are very careful about knowing what you are doing, they are easy to work with. I mean, all clients are easy to work with. In fact, I would go as far as to say is that one of the problems we have in consulting is that we take on too much work. We don't allocate sufficient partner level oversight over studies. We actually know that. We know that we have consultants on a study that is working on one study, doing work at night on another study, triple, double bill, double staffed. And then when the client doesn't understand something, we automatically say, well, the client's wrong. We're the brilliant consultants. Never once thinking that maybe we're so stretched that we're not giving sufficient time to communicating this and understanding the client's real concerns. And my real feeling is that consulting firms sometimes are too worried about growth. And if you just do a good work for one client, like what we did for Lab, right? We only ended up with this power sector study because we worked for Lab and executives knew each other and so on. Word goes around, hire these people, they know what they're doing, they'll do a good job. So my feeling is that focus on a few things, nail down the communication, make sure you understand what you are doing, and everything else will come out of it. Because one of the reasons people struggle with communication is they've got so many balls in the air that they just drop a few things. And they try to do too much, a few things fall and they don't know what's going on. But the point is, communication is more important than when you give your recommendation, which is what was written in one of the comments. When do you give the recommendation? It's not when you give the recommendation, it's how you give the recommendation, and whether you word that recommendation as a working hypothesis or as a final recommendation. The how is more important than the when. Communication trumps everything. It has always trumped everything. Now, I'm not saying I'm the world's best person at communication. I think my communication skills balance off the other horrible things, the other numerous things I'm horrible at. But in this particular thing, dealing with difficult clients or clients who are going through difficulty, this is an area that I grew up in terms of managing client situations.